Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya and welcome to another episode of TFiR Let's Talk. And today we have with us once again Prasad Dorbala, co-founder and chief product officer at Avesha. Prasad, it's great to have you back on the show.
Thank you, Swapnil. Good to see you again.
And today we are going to talk about kind of achieving improved security in multi-tenant and multi-cluster Kubernetes deployments. But before we go into this topic, I would just take this opportunity to once again remind our folks what is Avesha's open source KubeSlice all about, so they will also understand the foundation that why we are talking about multi-tenant and multi-cluster.
We have seen people deploy workloads, and Kubernetes is growing a lot. A lot of people are migrating into Kubernetes with their containerized workloads. And it starts off with a small team building certain set of applications. Suddenly another team comes up and then says, oh, look, I want to do something. So they create another cluster. And then the third team comes up and another set of clusters show up. Ultimately, the platform team, which is managing this, have a huge slew of cluster sprawl. Number one, every time you generate an infrastructure, it has a life of its own, right? It grows and grows and then becomes a production. And each one of these clusters, you need to have, visibility frameworks, constructs to manage and monitor what is happening inside it. And then it becomes a challenge when you have more and more clusters. And cost is a big factor, because every one of them creates a cost factor when you create more tools associated with it and hundreds of dashboards. It becomes a swivel chair, right, coming into it. And then suddenly different teams will come back and say, hey, I need to talk to each of these applications from the other team. Then the connectivity of these clusters becomes a challenge. Every time you try to go out of the cluster and then go into another cluster, you're kind of creating different security domains to be able to manage it and all that stuff. Hence, we have decided, say, this is a growing problem. And with our experience of running large-scale infrastructures, we found that how do we optimize that? How do we make it simple for application and as well as platform developers to consume infrastructure more meaningfully, cost-effective, don't create snowflakes, right? Being able to have a cohesive story with respect to, lifecycle management aspect of it, security boundaries associated with it. All of that need to be packaged in and then create a guardrails. Hence, KubeSlice came back with a notion of how do you create tenancy inside a cluster, because clusters are growing, right? Clusters can have hundreds and hundreds of nodes and thousands of pods, right? But how do we make sure you create a proper guardrails and security posture? That is what KubeSlice is all about, bringing multi-tenancy and realizing the fact that there is a time where you grow out of a single cluster for various reasons, right? You may want to have workloads closer to the customer, being edge-centric. How do I connect those things? So that is the reason why a tenancy inside a cluster and extend it to multi-cluster is what we built in KubeSlice.
When we do talk about multi-tenancy, multi-cluster, also these clusters can also be spread across different clouds. It's not just on the same cloud. You also talked about cost, and nothing is more costly than any security. You don't want to be in the newspaper, and because that's the most expensive thing. Not on downtime, brand tarnishing, but also unnecessary workload load for your developer teams as well. So can you talk about what are some of the main security concerns that are there? First of all, the things are changing so fast that it's like, once again, cat and mouse game, that we are exploring new things there. So talk about the security challenges that are there and how do you folks look at it?
Yeah, no, I tell you, I come from, in my previous job, my CEO, she used to put it into our brain. Security is job number one. So, she always used to say that I don't want to see our name in New York Times, right? So it is paramount important to have, although you want to have faster velocity from a development standpoint, right? You don't want to be creating bottlenecks for developers to execute faster. But on the other hand, you need to have proper framework and proper guardrails associated with it. Multi-tenancy comes with itself a bunch of challenges, right? As you know, Kubernetes, any pod can talk to any pod in any node. That's the philosophy, so that it makes it more simpler for applications to talk to each other. So it's one gigantic flat network, right? But there is a construct like namespaces to go isolate it, but you still, from a network standpoint, it is still one gigantic flat network. So you need to use, there are different primitives, right? Primitives are, how do I microsegment the cluster? Right? And isolate a certain set of workloads from others. How do I make sure there are RBAC rules associated with the team or a set of namespaces? So how do you make sure there is no denial of service, right? Because some other team had a bug in something. It doesn't matter whether it is intentional or not intentional, right? They had a bug. It actually, gets a host access and then laterally traverses and then kind of destroys different workloads, right? At the runtime, you need to focus on. So there are lots and lots of tools out there which actually does scanning upfront. But on the other hand, you need to also have defense in depth. Right? In defense in depth, you need to have not only DevSecOps principles are good, but also at the runtime, you need to make sure the infrastructure is maintaining all the balance with respect to isolation, with respect to containing, user access, where least privilege is most important, right? And then as well as resource management, right? You don't want to have a runaway pod hogging all kinds of autoscalers, killing in different workloads. So then you have a collateral damage with other applications not having any resources associated with it. And another primitive, which is very important, is API server, right? When you have a multi-tenancy, you have a single master node or master concept of multiple master nodes right there. API server and scheduler are very important factors. How do you make sure that you have rate limiting associated for tenancy to make sure that you have fairness for each tenant? Right? These are all fundamental things which are necessary in a multi-tenancy. Right? Now, think about it this way. Now, suddenly you have a capacity because your business is growing well, and suddenly your product team comes and says, hey, look, I want to have launch this service in Europe, or I want to launch this service in Southeast Asia, or whatever it is, or different geographical areas. Now, how do you, every application is bound to a certain namespace. Right? You tie your RBAC rules to a namespace. Now, when you have multi-cluster, how do you make sure that me, Prasad, who has access to a cluster A with a namespace X, right? When I create a new cluster, I need to make sure all the team which is associated with Prasad have the same access. So do you do different pipelines? How do you make sure that the config drift doesn't happen? So those are all the fundamental things which, when you extend it to multi-cluster, are very, very important and key foundations for security, right? First of all, you don't want people to least privileged access. You don't want people who are not supposed to access that, right? The second is that no resources are kind of overutilized. You would have to constrain them, right, to make sure that there is enough resources fairness associated with it. And then, API traffic, right? Every everybody needs to have fairness associated with that. All those constructs are built into KubeSlice, which helps create a perfect secure framework beyond the scanning. This is at the runtime. We help that.
You talked about some primitives. I also want to talk about what kind of primitives are there for security in Kubernetes. If I'm not wrong, last year a pod security policy was depreciated with version 1.21, I guess. So tell us, what options are there and what is the successor to PSP?
Oh yeah, pod security policy did a lot of wonders, right? But on the other hand, as you rightly said, it's a continually moving problem. And there are certain foundational things which you need to have at the in the base platform. I think Kubernetes 1.24 and above started with the prod security standard, right? Which is as security admission controller, which is actually built into it. And there are very foundational things, right? Whether you want to have it as a privileged access, or you want to have a baseline access or restricted access. So you can define it such a way that at the admission time, you can restrict what you want to do. And then as well as, sometimes everybody is focused on velocity, right? The more you put, breaks up front to do all these. I used to run teams where, a CISO used to be in my organization. Every product team needs to have a checklist saying that, okay, the security champions have approved your release or all the vulnerabilities. I mean, you think about it right now, there is a big, NSS or the government has said that I don't want to have any CVEs in the code. So scanning is important. But at the time of things happen, right? People bring in other third-party containers, right? Maybe the landscape is changing so fast that you want to have different defense in depth. So PSS is a foundational change, right? Where you are allowing or restricting it. You have all the controls in play. You can enforce it, you can audit it, or you can warn it. So for instance, if you want to try it out and see whether it actually, its violations are happening or not, you can warn it and then remediate it. So that is the advantage of the newer PSS framework, which comes with all the security guardrails which are built into it. So what we are in KubeSlice is doing is that we have a secure slice where we've built in all these foundational things so that one need not think as an afterthought. Right? Security is never an afterthought. It has to be built into it so that it is a kind of an innate ability to use that when you're deploying it. That is what we are building through KubeSlice.
You actually answered my next question, but if we look at PSS, they have three defined policies, privileged, baseline, and restricted. How do you implement these three in KubeSlice?
Yeah, no, I think fundamentally KubeSlice we segregate the network traffic, we isolate it. So we reduce the blast radius. Right? So you don't want to have, applications freely talking to everybody in entire cluster because the clusters are going big. Right? How do you shard from a network traffic standpoint? First principle is reduce the blast radius. Right? You don't want to have huge radius. Second principle is least privilege. Make sure that you have RBAC rules associated to a slice. What our concept of slice is a combination of namespaces, because every application team you think of are not going to be just a single namespace. You need to have combination of namespaces. So how do you create an abstract term? That is what we call it as a slice, is combining multiple namespaces, be it in single cluster or be it in across multi-cluster, be it in a same region or be it multi-cloud. right? It doesn't matter to us. So we created that framework of KubeSlice by segmenting the network traffic, number one, segmenting, giving least privilege and only access to the area where they want. And then we have controls to make sure that you have different RBAC roles associated with it, right? And then bind that to a specific namespaces as defined by it, right? And then resource management, right? Number one thing is that let's say I have a team and they have a critical workload. What is important is the network traffic. Starvation is one important factor which we see often, is that some other workload sitting on this node is eating up all the traffic on that node or CPU on that node. Then you're stuck, right? You need to have a clear isolation, clear definition of what resources can be used and not used, right? And then bound that. So that is one thing we do. And then as well as preservation of API traffic by giving fair share of fairness across multi-tenancy. That is something which we are building in KubeSlice as a foundational thing. Now, given that it happens in a single cluster, you can also extend it to multi-cluster, right? So all the semantics which you have built in a single cluster will automatically get transferred into different clusters. So suddenly, if you are Prasad, you are used to logging into US East. When you have a new capacity which is added to US West or some other region, you don't want to just think that, oh, do I have all the RBAC rules propagated? That is not for you to think, right? It automatically happens. So now you have the right guardrails in across multi-cluster.
One more question before we wrap this up. Earlier, you were talking about cost. We are looking at economic downturn. Companies are looking at cost cutting, but the kind of the field that is that the security is often excluded from cost cutting. What are you seeing? And I mean, realistically, because you actually do deal with a lot of customers and users, the impact there. And then once again, by having these kind of policies in place, how do you help these users so that they don't have to compromise with security, even if they are going through some cost cutting?
Yeah, no, I think security, think about it from a standpoint of the business impact if you are on New York City, or New York Times newspaper, right? That is bigger impact than having to have the right guardrails, time, and making sure the right framework in place, right? With a security conscious. So nobody is going to worry about cost if you had a trade-off between availability or somebody hacked into you, and then you are kind of suddenly now have all the legal challenges to deal with, right? So from that standpoint, it is important. Second, most important is, but on the other hand, that doesn't mean to say you throw infrastructure, waste it, and all that stuff. You need to have the right balance. That the right balance is create a framework which actually lets you tell you when you are doing something, so that this is not something you have to, we are allowed to do. So remediate it so that you can, that mitigation factor helps you deploy it. So security is something which I think it has to be inculcated in day one at the time of code development and as well as at the time of deployment. So what we are helping is giving that framework so that it actually makes you sleep better. You don't feel like somebody is hacking into you. Well, on the other hand, right, it's a moving target. You have to constantly keep at it, right? That's the reason why we say defense in depth. Every layer of defense is important. And the layer which we are addressing is at the runtime, right? That doesn't mean to say that you don't want to do scanning. You have to do scanning upfront. DevSecOps is a philosophy rather than a principle. It's a design principles. That's something you need to have. And at the runtime, you don't want to be relaxed. You do want to have all the guardrails needed on it. That is what we add using KubeSlice. Swapnil.
Prasad, thank you so much for taking time out today and not only talk about the security in multi-tenant, multi-cluster environment, but also share some kind of tips, if I can call them, how companies can improve their security posture in this, changing not only technological landscape but also economical landscape. So thanks for sharing those insights as well. And as usual, I would love to have you back on the show. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Swapnil. It was great talking to you again.